All right guys, so we're gonna look at the 3-point row variation, but also its cousin, the elbow supported row variation as well. So Charlie's gonna start by picking up the dumbbell here. Now you'll notice here that he's got a bit of an offset stance, obviously 3-point, given that he's got hand at the top of the bench, knee sitting below the hip. So it's important that this knee is not sitting too far ahead of the hip, and also it's not too far back either. So hip on top of the knee. And then that outside leg, the key consideration here is that there needs to be enough clearance room for that dumbbell to go so that he can get the elbow back and into the base of the spine rather than making contact with the leg. So depending on who you are as an individual, you might have to go a bit wider, you might have to bring the leg a little bit further back, but plenty of clearance room. So just be mindful of that when you start your setup. Now, next thing as well here is, like we said, the focus on here is really not about the dumbbell coming up the way here, which is a common mistake we see. So just do that a second, Charlie. You see this kind of high pull and almost kind of like almost excessive upper trap usage, excessive rear delt usage. Doesn't mean that we're not getting a little bit of rear delt towards the end of the movement, but it's not really the focus here. The focus is to really take that lat from being in somewhat of a lengthened position and really shortening it by dragging that humerus up in towards the base of the spine. Now, one thing to bear in mind as well is a lot of people will try to exceed their active range and they'll kind of use too much momentum, so they'll try to like throw it up there. And really, when you actually keep this movement pretty strict, so nice control one, Charlie, it's really not as much range as you might think it is if we're actually keeping it in the lats. Now, another mistake as well is actually not allowing yourself a little bit of rotation. There's absolutely nothing wrong with just a very slight amount of rotation towards end range just to help get it short. We just have to be mindful that it's not excessive. All right, and then one more, Charlie. So when we get into this position, make sure we're controlling down, and depending on how it's been programmed, we might cue a little bit more of a protraction or a pause here, or we might cue just to maintain this position, especially if you're just acquiring the skill of the row early on in your training career. All right guys, we're gonna look at another way we can set up for the 3-point row, which is this elbow supported variation. Now there's one key setup consideration that is a bit different from this to the 3-point row, although it could apply across both as well, really. And then there's an execution consideration we also have to look at here. So first of all, if we're going to have this elbow supported here, you see he's got that forearm kind of braced against the ridge of the top of the bench here. Now it's very easy to allow yourself to become passive here and almost let just yourself sink down, the head of the humerus dunking back into the capsule here. So what we need to really think about is almost actively protracting through the bench just to really provide that bit of active support and stability. So once that's locked in place, the torso is locked in place, we've got our 3-point stance, there's plenty of clearance room for the dumbbell to move, we're good to go. Now, one mistake we're going to commonly see here is that as well as this kind of coming too high or pulling too straight up, we're often going to see, and this is kind of associated with this to a degree as well, we're going to see excessive elbow flexion here as well. And what you'll see is almost the forearm slopes down and away from his body. So one way to almost think about this, just to check or form check yourself, is if we think about this forearm to elbow, that wrist stays under the elbow throughout, and we're keeping this almost like perpendicular to the floor the entire time. That's going to ensure that we're making sure that it's mostly coming from that upper arm extending back and around to the base of the spine, rather than excessively using those biceps and pulling right up, and it ends up just becoming a bit of a drag curl instead of a row. Now, another variation we can look at here, and this is a great variation of the row as well, is we can, if we want to minimize the amount of elbow flexion, we can perform the old school drag curl. So this one actually involves really minimizing how much you bend at the arm, and it's really just focusing on dragging this upper arm back as much towards the hip as you possibly can. And this is a fantastic movement, not only for teaching someone how to get the lat really kind of short with minimal elbow flexion, but it's also a great one you can chuck in either as a pre-exhaust or a post-exhaust, and then you can get right back into that 3-point row where we've got that little bit of mechanical advantage from that elbow bend there as well. So these are two fantastic options for really biasing those lats.